Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Chairing the first plenary session this morning on regional security in the Bay of Bengal is Professor S.D. Muni, Visiting Research Professor, ISAS. With him on stage are our plenary speakers, Ambassador K. Kesavapany, Retired Vice Admiral P.S. Das, Professor Imtiaz Ahmed, and Dr. Wang Han Ling. I now pass the floor to Professor Muni to chair the session.
Welcome, everyone. We are here to discuss regional security in Bay of Bengal. I don't think this gathering needs me to underline what the salient features, the strategic dimensions of Bay of Bengal are. I think Bay of Bengal is the main area through which most of the trade and the sea lanes of communication flow through. Is an area which is rich in energy and other resources. This is an area which has seen extreme internal political turbulence in some of the countries. And this is also an area which I think is going to see quite a rigorous competition for strategic space, particularly between India and China. But I think after what I call the Obama watch, like in Australia, the US will also butt in a very, very significant way. And that would cause ripples, which sometimes may be uncomfortable. But that would also open up opportunities for the countries to take creative initiatives and see how the strategic security situation unfolds in the region. We have a formidable panel to throw light on some of the involved issues. We have very eminent people who have huge experience with them, experience in naval dealings, experience in diplomacy, experience of very rigorous academic research. And I think these three perspectives would seem to merge when they explore security situation in Bay of Bengal. First of all, may I request Ambassador Kesavapany to make his presentation. It would not be fair on my part to introduce Ambassador Kesavapany to this audience in Singapore. One of the most senior diplomat, has done diverse diplomatic assignments, High Commissioner of Malaysia, representative at the United Nations in Geneva, chairman of the General Council of WTO, first chairman of the General Council of WTO, and a chief negotiator for ASEAN in some of the critical trade issues. But more than all that, I have seen Ambassador Kesavapany reshape and reinforce and uplift the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore for last 5-6 years, if I remember correctly. I can say that because before he came, I had an experience of being with the Institute. And I really am sorry that I was not there when he is in charge of the affairs there. Ambassador Kesavapany.
As the director of a sister institute, normally I get others to perform. This is one of the few times I've been asked to perform. But it's a very interesting topic to talk about. And I'm going to address the issue from a very unusual perspective, the perspective of climate change and what climate change and how it is going to affect geopolitics in the Bay of Bengal region. Let me begin with a discussion of climate change and the possible impacts of sea level rises on the Bay of Bengal. I chose this method because if climate change issues are not addressed, many of the countries or parts of the countries will not be here for a very long time, and that is why I chose this critical issue to talk about. We have to rethink the role of traditional military security institutions in order to respond effectively to both climate change and natural disasters. Also, it is important to strengthen bilateral and multilateral cooperation among littoral states in the Bay of Bengal. For example, if sea levels rise by 20 centimeters in the Bay of Bengal, they will hurt more than 10 million people in Bangladesh. In Vietnam, more than 35% of its population will be affected by a 5-meter sea level rise. According to International Organization for Migration, the number of displaced people across the globe by 2050 could be about 200 million. Out of these, as many as 26 million could be from Bangladesh and 20 million from India. That explains the magnitude of the problem that we are facing. For those living in and around South Asia, especially in the littorals of Bay of Bengal, the findings of a recent Greenpeace study entitled Blue Alert states that in the event of global temperatures rising by about 4 to 5 degrees centigrade, the South Asian region would witness mass migration affecting nearly 130 million people. India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh will be at the greatest risk. Such potential threats are likely to challenge the traditional understanding of security. Climate change respects no boundaries between countries and regions. Hence, there is a need for traditional military security institutions to rethink their strategies and doctrines in order to respond effectively to climate change and natural disasters. The potential of the Bay of Bengal as a politico-economic strategic bridge between South Asia and Southeast Asia is yet to be fully realized. This would be my next angle of presentation. Let us look at some of the present structures in existence. Laudable efforts have been made by the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, SARC, and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, and sub-regional initiatives such as the Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral Technical and Economic Cooperation, BIMSTEC. These institutions, however, do not act as a complete, but rather more like a disjointed bridge between South Asia and Southeast Asia. Climate change and sea level rises merit urgent attention and responses at the local, national, and regional levels. The crux of the issue is how do we build innovative regional approaches to bridge security cooperation between South and Southeast Asia. In Southeast Asia, climate change has been addressed through the framework of ASEAN community building. ASEAN member states have made a number of declarations and statements supporting the reduction in greenhouse emissions. These include the ASEAN Declaration of Environmental Sustainability, the ASEAN Declaration COP13, the Kyoto Protocol, the ASEAN Joint Statement on Climate Change, etc. In April 2011, for the first time, ASEAN defense ministers, note the word, defense ministers, were unanimous in their view that the member states' militaries must work together and respond in a coordinated manner to address natural disasters. It was also agreed that member states need to develop common strategies and standard operating procedures to respond to earthquakes, tsunamis, typhoons, and floods. The security implications of climate change and their impact on regional peace have also been acknowledged at the international and regional fora. The UN has noted that climate change and national security are interlinked. This is not to suggest that climate change will be the primary reason for nations to go to war, but could act as a catalyst for instability or conflict. Increasingly, US and NATO militaries have now listed humanitarian assistance and disaster relief as a major task and have revised their security strategy to meet requirements both at home and overseas. Likewise, several Asian militaries, such as those of China, India, Japan, Malaysia, Thailand, and Singapore, have integrated HADR operations in their missions and roles. However, the Bay of Bengal littoral countries' capacity to respond to climate change-induced disasters is still quite limited, other than in the case of India, Indonesia, and Thailand. Disaster diplomacy has emerged as an important tool of international relations and has opened channels for communications and facilitated relief to affected peoples. However, it will be useful to keep in mind that disaster support for humanitarian purposes must be undertaken carefully, keeping in mind the sensitivities of the country that is the victim of a disaster. In Asia, we see an interesting situation where external assistance in the form of disaster relief is welcome, but is sought selectively and with some caution. For example, during the tsunami, Indonesia accepted foreign troops only when it became clear that its own military could not deal with the devastation. India announced that it could handle the post-tsunami situation all by itself and did not require external support. Likewise, Thailand announced it could cope on its own, but gradually allowed the US to operate from its territory to facilitate transport of relief materials and operations to Aceh. In Aceh itself, it was because of external intervention that peace settlement arose out of that disaster. During the recent floods in Thailand in October 2011, a US aircraft carrier left port without deploying an airlift service for Thai flood victims because the Thai authorities had assessed that the flood situation was not serious enough to merit US assistance. In another situation, the Myanmar government was not quite willing to allow US and French warships and aircraft to provide disaster relief during Cyclone Nargis. Ultimately, it was ASEAN persuasion that enabled or that led to the Myanmar government to look for external assistance. Now, in the midst of this, what are we looking at in terms of a new architecture for regional cooperation to address the issues that I've just mentioned? As I said, there are already a number of international and sub-regional groupings that are closely related to the Bay of Bengal region. In addition to BIMSTEC, they have the Bay of Bengal Large Marine Ecosystem Project, the ASCAP. These organizations, institutions, and groupings have established forums and networks to address climate change in the Bay of Bengal. At the Bay of Bengal levels, issues relating to climate change have been taken up at BIMSTEC and other meetings. The above developments are nevertheless significant and suggest that Bay of Bengal countries do acknowledge the fact that climate change, environmental conservation, and disaster management are critical issues for the region and should be given higher priority. It is quite evident from the above discussion that more needs to be done to establish a clear-cut initiative to address collectively non-traditional security threats. I believe there is a clear nexus between politics and climate change management. Peace within and among states creates the condition for real progress to be made in tackling issues relevant to this subject. In that context, there have been recent political strategic developments within some countries that promise to usher in a new era of bilateral and multilateral understandings and cooperations. For example, Myanmar has been quite proactive with regard to its domestic political transition and has taken a number of initiatives that showcase to the international community its new approaches to foreign policy and development. Until now, the missing link was Myanmar. We could not really integrate between Southeast Asia and South Asia because of that black zone, which is now hopefully coming out into the open. It is vital that ASEAN and the rising Asian economies play a vital role in helping Myanmar through its transition to reforms In this context, Myanmar President Thein Sein's visit to India in October was especially significant. Now, in Bangladesh, ever since the Awami League government came to power under the leadership of Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina Wajid in January 2009, bilateral relations between India and Bangladesh have witnessed an upward trajectory. India, on its part, has offered major investments in Bangladesh. The two sides have also mutually agreed to enhance connectivity between India's northeastern states and Bangladesh and harness the economic potential of adjoining regions of South Asia and Southeast Asia. There's a great study being done to link Southeast Asia and India through Bangladesh. Again, the stumbling block is Myanmar. Hopefully, this stumbling block with the developments going on now can be overcome. As far as the challenge of climate change is concerned, both countries have acknowledged the need to exchange national data and experiences in mitigation and adaptation. One of the outstanding and innovative steps taken by both India and Bangladesh is to address the challenge of unsustainable development and climate change, which is MOU called the Conservation of the Sundarbans was signed on 6 September 2011. The politico-strategic transformations in the Bay of Bengal are likely to be influenced by broader geopolitical trends that are making the boundaries between the Indian and Pacific Oceans increasingly porous and creating an expanded, interlinked geopolitical strategic space. Recently, the term Indo-Pacific was used by some analysts to tap out these trends. They include growing strategic links between the Indian and Pacific Oceans in terms of the growing volume and density of maritime traffic through transoceanic sea lanes of communication, India's rising regional and global profile, and further extension of its Look East policy to an Engage East policy, and growing maritime dialogues and partnerships between India, Australia, and other like-minded countries. According to a recent study, a US-Australia-India trilateral dialogue would go a long way towards addressing near-term priorities, even as it promotes an order in the Indo-Pacific that is conducive to economic and political stability, security, continued free and open trade, and democratic governance. Once we factor in the challenges related to non-traditional security threats, human security, and climate change, the term Indo-Pacific is likely to acquire a far more nuanced connotation. My conclusion is this. As the consequences of climate change unfold at an incremental pace, resulting in displacements, the challenges to human livelihood security are likely to multiply in number and intensity. While it is difficult to deny the close link between the concept of security and the armed forces of nation-states, the traditional roles and missions of the militaries are being transformed to address new climate-induced, non-traditional threats to comprehensive security. In the area of climate change, geography needs to be visualized as composed of delicately interlocked ecosystems, which, in the case of the Bay of Bengal, transcend national boundaries and call for regional and sub-regional cooperation between South Asia and Southeast Asia. In short, we need a new understanding of both geography and politics, that is, a new geopolitics. Thank you very much.
One name which prominently pops up there is of Admiral Das. I met him about 20 years earlier when he was commanding the Eastern Command of India. He has served in Andaman and Nicobar, and therefore the best Indian strategic mind to look at Bay of Bengal as closely as one can. He was also a member of the task force constituted by Government of India to review the higher defense management in India. He has interacted with any number of think tanks on India's behalf and served also as a member of the National Security Advisory Board, which advises the national security system in India, not only Prime Minister, but the whole system. He will share his thoughts with us on India's maritime strategy.
Thank you. Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, ambassadors, Mr. Chairman, it's my great privilege to be here today, especially because so many people I've known for many years. The chair, for example, Ambassador Kesavapany, High Commissioner Moon, and others. This morning, Minister Kiak said that India began its Look East policy in 1992. For me, Looking East began in 1958, when as a young naval cadet, my ship took me to Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, Vietnam, and Thailand. Since then, I've visited many of these countries again and again, none more often than Singapore. So it's great to be here again. When I first came to Singapore in 1958, and this for the younger friends there, CK Tang was a one-floor department store. The only other department store here was a place called Robinson's in Raffles Square. And the bulk of our shopping was done in a place called Change Alley, where you haggled, and the guy kept on saying, last price, last price. And when you finally settled for the last price, you felt bad because you felt, could there have been a more last price? But that was Singapore, and really I have grown as Singapore has grown to where it has come today. India has been a seafaring country for long, and that is why you see the temples in Thailand and why you see the names of the Thai kings on the Hindu god Rama. You see the temples in Angkor Wat, you see the temples in Bali. But India has never been what is commonly understood as a sea power. It never understood the meaning of the sea. The many invaders who came to India came from the north. The British who came from the sea ensured one thing, that whereas in the course of time they inducted Indians into the land forces, they never ever shed their total control over sea power of the Indian sea continent. Even after independence, for the next 50 years, we were all the time focused on land. We fought wars with Pakistan, we fought a war with China, we fought counterinsurgency, we are still doing so. But the sea remained distant from India's consciousness until 20 years ago, when India realized that for national power, economic growth was key. And economic growth, apart from other things, required two things. One is security of energy, and the other security of trade. And both depended on the ability to ensure their safe movement at sea, what is referred to as safety of commons. In the last 20 years, India has begun to move seawards. The chairman referred to President Osama's Asia-Pacific orientation. In Bali, he became the first American president ever to come to the East Asian Summit. Why is it that Asia has become this focus, or the Asia-Pacific? Look at the facts. 2 of the 4 largest economies are Asian. 15 years from now, 3 of the 4 largest economies will be Asian. 3 of the 4 largest militaries are Asian. 4 of the 8 nuclear weapon states are Asian. If there is to be a 5th, chances are it will be Asian. 70% of all non-state terrorist actors are Asian. Energy is in Asia. So it is not surprising that Asia-Pacific is now touted as the scene of future global security concerns. Who are the players here? For all its problems and all its ills, let us look at the facts of the United States of America. Economy equal to the next 4 countries put together. Military expenditure more than next 75 countries put together. Technology unequaled. So if anybody thinks that the United States of America is disappearing from Asia Pacific, that will be highly optimistic. This brings me to China. It's not just China's economic power. It is not rising. It has risen. It is the major Asian power. It is also its military power, and today, even more than military power, its growing maritime power. So China is a major Asian player. How about India? Economy growing without governance at 7.5%. With governance, I do not know if and when it should come. Its Navy and Air Force among the 6th largest in the world. Its Army among the 3rd largest in the world. So it will be unfair to rule out India as a rising Asian power in the years to come. Japan, for all its defensive posture, the fact of the matter is that the conventional Japanese naval strength is more than the conventional Chinese naval strength. Its expense on the maritime self-defense force is equal to the Indian defense expenditure put together. So it is a major Asian player. Let us not forget that. ASEAN countries are a major factor in the Asian power equation. So also the Central Asian republics and the Southwest Asian countries. So we are seeing a scene where there are several characters, players who are going to be part of the Asian Pacific security scenario. If Asia Pacific is going to be the center of our concerns, then we come to the next factor, the sea, which is the Indo-Pacific. Until recently, for India when it began, the sea consisted of the North Arabian Sea. This is where we fought Pakistan. Once we engaged with China, Bay of Bengal, the eastern theater came into play. So now we had the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal. And this gradually expanded into the North Indian Ocean, and thereafter into the Indian Ocean, and now into the Indo-Pacific. Why is it the Indo-Pacific? If the lifelines of China, if the lifelines of Japan are tied to the Indo-Pacific, if India's bilateral trade through the Eastern Passage was $300 billion last year, will cross $500 billion in 2015, will reach $1 trillion in 2020. So it is inconceivable that this stretch of water, which passes through the Southeast Asian archipelago and goes through the South and East China Sea, is not going to be of concern to India. So the concerns have expanded from these two seas into the Indian Ocean, into the Indo-Pacific. What are the concerns in the Indo-Pacific? In the Indian Ocean, the concerns are non-state actors. The concerns are of piracy, of maritime terrorism. We saw maritime terrorism when a US destroyer was sunk in Aden. We saw maritime terrorism when a French tanker was attacked in the Gulf of Aden. We saw maritime terrorism when offshore terminals of Basra were attacked. And the latest example of maritime terrorism we saw in Mumbai when some people came 500 miles by sea and created mayhem in Bombay. And now we are seeing the piracy in Somalia over the last 3 years. Earlier on, we have seen the piracy in the Malacca Straits. So the concerns are non-traditional, non-state actors. On the other side, the disputes are between nation states. They are between one country, China, and they are between several other countries. There is one country which has a certain interpretation of what is sovereignty or what are laws of the sea. There are other countries who have different interpretation of what the laws of the sea are. There is tension, there is uncertainty. What will happen into the future is not known. But the differences are there. In the Indian Ocean, vulnerabilities because of choke points and threats from non-state actors. On the other side, possibility of nation-state conflict. This is the context in which we see the situation in the Indo-Pacific. Now, what are India's concerns? I think India's concerns can be marked at two levels, strategic and proximate. India is, after all, the largest country in the Indian Ocean. It has coastlines on both sides. It has far-flung island territories. It sits astride the most important trade routes of the world, through which much of the world's energy flows. It has responsibility ensuring that the safety of commerce is ensured. It has responsibility ensuring that the area around it is congenial to its security sensitivities. The proximate interests are different. I mentioned energy. India by 2020 will import 20% of its energy. The safety of the ships which bring it across the oceans, the safety of these ships in ports and harbors, the safety of its offshore exploration, these are all vital national interests. Look at trade. India's trade last year was $600 billion bilateral. It will cross $2 trillion in the year 2020. Almost all of it will move across the sea. through the East Asian region, $1 trillion by 2020. So the movement of this trade has become a critically important thing. Minister Kiak said this morning that India's trade with ASEAN has increased from $7 billion 10 years ago to $60 billion ago. And that's true. It will cross $100 billion in 5 years' time thereafter. Look at our trade with China. It was $500 million in 1995. It is $60 billion this year and growing at 30% per year. Maybe this trade is slightly skewed. Maybe we are importing more manufacturers. Maybe we are importing more raw materials. But the fact of the matter is $60 billion is $60 billion. And that figure can't be brushed aside. So trade through these areas, through the eastern waters, is critical to India's self-interest. Now, unlike traditional threats from nation-state actors, where India is more or less in the standalone mode militarily, not part of any military alliances, though it may move diplomatically in different ways, against non-state threat, standalone capabilities are not good enough. You have to be in cooperation with others. India's interests on the eastern seaboard, I have already mentioned to you, in the east areas. So look at our security cooperation involvement in this part of the world. Security cooperation with Singapore, about the best in the world, second only to the United States of America. Security cooperation with Indonesia, security cooperation with Thailand, security cooperation with Malaysia, security cooperation with Philippines, security cooperation with Vietnam, developing relations with Myanmar. These are all part of this low-key strategy which we realize that without maritime security cooperation is not going to proceed as strongly as it should. I must say something about China, because people will say you have spoken about everything but not about China. Now, there are a whole lot of negatives. We all know the negatives. I'm not here to recount history of the conflict and so on. But the fact of the matter is that there is a border dispute. There is a fact of China's continued military assistance to Pakistan over the years, including in the nuclear field. There is a background of assistance to neighbors, which has not gone well with India's security sensitivities. These are all the negatives. Look at the positives. One is this 500 million trade, which has gone to $60 billion. That's one. The border is reasonably tranquil. There has been no activity on the border. Several visits by Chinese leaders, Wen Jiabao in 2005, Hu Jintao in 2006, Wen Jiabao again in 2010, have all said a message which is clear, that both countries have space to grow together and both are partners in the Asian scene, and that if both combine, it will be a 21st century of Asia. Now, is this rhetoric? Is this going to be a reality? It is different to say. As military planners, our requirement is only one. We look at capabilities and plan for capabilities. We don't look at intentions. Capabilities do not mean that we have to match capabilities. Capabilities simply mean that we should have that capability which should be sufficiently dissuasive. Do I see a prospect of war with China? Highly improbable. China is on a path of achieving growth which will bring it on par with the United States of America. Any war will be the last thing that China wants. Any war is the last thing that India wants. It itself is on a trajectory which wants to see economic growth, the well-being of its people, etc., etc. Can I say, therefore, that war is ruled out? Nothing is ruled out. But the fact that a war is around the corner is not probable. Ambassador Gopinath Pillai said about hyper-tense medias, and that's true in both sides. You only have to read the Global Times of recent times to see what is happening on the other side. And of course, the Indian side, he said there's a breaking news requirement every half hour. I would say a breaking news requirement is every minute on the 300 Indian channels, because without that, they cannot survive. There have been some recent cases which could be called conflictual between India and China. There was a case when an Indian high-ranking general was not given a visa to visit China. There was a case when certain staple visas were being given to nationals of people who lived in Jammu and Kashmir. There's a claim on Arunachal Pradesh of India. But these are ups and downs in India-China relationship, which I think will continue. One final thing about China I'll mention, because that has got a lot of currency, at sea especially. It is called the string of pearls. Frankly, like all good-looking words, it is an American patronage. It is not a word coined by India, string of pearls. What is the meaning of string of pearls? What are they saying? That China is developing a port in Myanmar, China is developing a port in Sri Lanka, China is developing a port in Gwadar in Pakistan. So they are all constituting a string around India. Add to that China's forays into Seychelles, Mozambique, etc., etc. Does China have a legitimate presence in the Indian Ocean? Answer is yes. A great part of its trade and energy moves in the Indian Ocean. So if Singapore and Malaysia can send ships to counter piracy in Gulf of Aden, why not China, which has more interest? Does China have a legitimate interest in developing ports? Of course. If the Dutch can do it, if the English can do it, if Indians can do it here and there, why not China? Does it itself breed or create an air of insecurity? Answer is no. But what will add to this picture if a scene comes when any of these places is made available as a naval base facility? Is that going to happen anytime soon? Is that a real possibility? Once again, nobody can say it's not a possibility. It could happen, but chances of its happening are not high. The reason is because countries which may want whatever assistance from whoever are reluctant to offer any of their places as naval base facilities. And I'll be honest with you and quote an example of India. When the Indo-Soviet relationship was at its strongest, when the military assistance to India was coming in the largest numbers, when the naval port of Visakhapatnam was being developed with Soviet assistance, when the Soviets said to India, can we send 3 ships to Visakhapatnam? We said no. You can send them to Mumbai for a goodwill visit, you can send them to Goa, you can send them to Kochi, but sorry, not to Visakhapatnam. So we did not accept any ship, Soviet warship in Visakhapatnam, leave aside the question of base facility. You can say India is a big country, could afford to do that. Can a smaller country afford to do that? I think in today's world, there's no big country and no small country. In these matters, when countries think that their national interest does not require a port facility to be given, they will not give it. And let us not forget the international environment. Will Sri Lanka be happy with India around to give a place as a Chinese naval facility? Will Pakistan be able to give Gwadar with Saudi Arabia and Americans around the corner? It is not going to be possible. Let me conclude by saying a simple thing. For India, sea is increasingly becoming a major source of interest. 2, at sea, cooperation with Southeast Asia is becoming increasingly important and will be pursued. Our Prime Minister is fond of using a word saying something for which a time has come. In 1992, looking east was a concept for which the time had come. In 2005, the Indo-nuclear deal was a thing for which the time has come. Today, security cooperation at sea with eastern countries is a thing for which the time has come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Admiral. He had a very prestigious award from the Social Science Research Council of the US, and he was also made an honorary citizen by the state of Maryland, USA in 1993. There are any number of books which he has to his credit, any number of articles, research papers he has to his credit, and more than that, I know him as one of the most dynamic and vibrant scholar from Bangladesh who has looked at whole of the South Asian region very, very closely. Imtiaz.
Well, a decade back, I wrote a paper on Bangladesh-Myanmar relations, but somehow I had misplaced that text, and it was way back in 2001. The only place I thought I could get it quickly was to Google it, and there it was. Curiosity, however, came along as to what other materials were there in the Google on the subject. In this age of Googleization of knowledge and the Wikileaksization of official correspondence, you cannot help looking at things marked Wiki, including Wikipedia. And to my surprise, there was an entry in the Wikipedia marked Bangladesh-Burma relations. What got my attention the most, however, was the very first line of the anonymous writer. And let me quote the person. The neighboring countries of Bangladesh and Burma, officially Myanmar, currently has an ambiguous bilateral relationship unquote. Ambiguous neighbors indeed, but then how ambiguous is the relationship, and if so, why is it such? A greater part of the ambiguity, I believe, lies in the manner in which international relations, or IR, has evolved and come to be understood. The centrality of the state following Westphalia and the hegemony discourse of realism seems to have blinded IR into focusing primarily on the state-to-state relations, while much of what constitutes the state and what remains outside its fold have become of greater relevance, if not contentious. This is particularly true in this era of globalization, when dichotomies like internal, external, and domestic, foreign, or what Rabindranath Tagore had referred to as the home and the world a century back, have become blurred, with each remaining simultaneously internal and external to the other. Bangladesh-Myanmar relations are no exception. For the sake of brevity, I will limit myself to 3 areas that have come to inform Bangladesh-Myanmar relations and remain critical to this day, indeed, with a possible outcome bordering on both anxiety and hope. The 3 areas are the stateless, the non-state, and the post-state. Let me speak or reflect on the stateless, and this refers particularly the plight of the Rohingyas. Well, in Bangladesh today, we have around 27,150 officially documented Rohingya refugees who have been there for almost 2 to 3 decades. Now, that's an official count, but you do have an unofficial count, in fact, over 200,000 to 300,000 who are undocumented. Now, the question is, not only they are refugees, but they are also stateless, and that's the problem. Because twice they were repatriated, but somehow they crept in, and in both times, in fact, the promise of statelessness or statehood was not granted, so they remain simultaneously, particularly when they're in Bangladesh, they remain simultaneously refugees and stateless, and when they go back as repatriated, they remain stateless. Now the question is, who are these Rohingyas, in fact? Now, one school of historians suggests that Rohingyas are descendants of Moorish, Arab, and Persian traders, including Mughal, Turk, Pathan, and Bengali soldiers come migrants who arrived between the 9th and 15th centuries, married local women, and settled in the region. It may be mentioned that there was a regular arrival of Muslims from Afghanistan, Persia, and Turkey, as well as from North India and the Arabian Peninsula. They amalgamated with the Muslim society and became the Rohingyas. As a result, a distinct dialect was formed by the mixture of Persian, Urdu, Pashto, Arakanese, and Bengali. To this school, Rohingyas are a mixed group of people with many ethnic and racial relations. Thus, the Muslim presence already existed in northern Arakan even before Islam reached Bengal in the 13th century. But there is another school which argues that ethnically, culturally, and linguistically, the Rohingyas are closely related to the Bengalis, and particularly the people of Chittagong area of Bangladesh. The Muslim population of the Rakhine state is the descendant of Bengali migrants from Bengal, now Bangladesh, with some Indians coming during the British period. It is also emphasized that most of them speak Bengali with a strong Chittagonian dialect, so they are regarded as illegal immigrants from Bangladesh. The government of Myanmar, most of the Burman Buddhist populations believe in this conception. The military regime in Myanmar prohibits the use of the term Rohingya, arguing it is the creation of Bengali insurgents and referred to them instead as Bengali intruders. The pro-regime scholars tend to argue that the cause of Rohingyas finds little support outside their own community, and their claims of an early historical tie to Burma are insupportable. Now, if that is the case, then why would the Myanmar government twice repatriate them with the support of the UNHCR, without, however, providing them the status of citizenship? Now, the problem is far greater, in fact, in this age of globalization, and this is particularly a thing that I want to flag. Now, Years back, in fact, I wrote a paper, and this was right after 9/11, which will give you some sense as to what, if you have a stateless people, what can happen in this age of globalization. Now, let me read out from that piece, and that will give you some idea where we are with the stateless. September 11 has been an eye-opener for many. Let me share mine. When I first met Salim, obviously not his real name, I had no clue that I was meeting a Rohingya. I got a call from him the night before and found him eager to meet me the very next day. This was incidentally a year or two before 9/11. The meeting was brief but precise. The discussion went like this. Do you know that I am a Rohingya? Not really. Do you know anything about us? A little. How little? Well, your traditional home is in the Arakan, and you have been driven out by the Myanmar military government several times into Bangladesh, and now, save 21,000, all of you have gone back to the Arakan. Do you know that we are still stateless people, and the Myanmar government has refused to recognize us as citizens since 1948? Well, yes, I heard something about that. Do you think the people of Bangladesh know that? I doubt. Do you think the people of this region know that? I doubt. Do you think the world knows about our plight, about our statelessness? I doubt. Well, I have no doubts. No one knows about us. No one cares about us. Is this living? Have you any idea how difficult it is for a stateless person to live in this world, and that again for over 50 years, practically from birth to death? What do you want me to do? Write about us, speak about us. The younger generation is becoming violent every day. They don't want to live like this. They want to change things. If nothing is done soon, it will be difficult to stop their rage, unquote. Now, Salim left as he came, unnoticed, but in appearance slightly disturbed. I must confess that I was moved by his plea and saw merit in this argument. But then, when the world came to know about the Rohingyas' rage, albeit in bits and pieces, I never thought that it would be in relation to 9/11, or more precisely, in relation to the aftermath of 9/11. Soon after the US military got rid of the Taliban, they came to know that some Rohingya fighters made their way into Afghanistan and were trained by the Taliban. So my argument here is that you have a situation which is stateless, and if you do not resolve it, in fact, if you keep it, in fact, it can lead to something of a demon that we have seen happening with the Taliban in Afghanistan. That's one part of the stateless story. The second one is a non-state. Now, people, when they refer to non-state, yes, it could be the economic context also. There are non-state elements in there, but there's also dubious elements in the non-state, something which my previous speakers have already spoken a little bit. Two things, in fact, when it comes to Bangladesh-Myanmar relations. One is the drug trade, which I'm sure all of you are familiar. But more importantly, the recent development in the drug trade. Now, it used to be opium, in fact, and how that used to get processed into heroin. But when the natural drugs or the production of opium became a serious concern globally, Myanmar and in the Thai-Myanmar border, we have found the drug laws switched to synthetic drugs, and that one that emerged and became very prominent is what is known as the madness medicine, or Yaba, the Thai name for madness medicine. Now that has become quite a thing, in fact, and it's a global phenomenon, the synthetic drugs, I'm sure people who are familiar. So there again, in fact, if you keep something, going without really pushing things far, then it can come to you unnoticed and in a big way. Important also is the fact of the arms bazaar. Now this has to be looked from different angles, because there are different ethnic / subnational movements within Myanmar, or in around Myanmar, both in Bangladesh-Myanmar border and Myanmar-India border, not to mention Northeast India itself. But let me give you some figure, and you can see how desperate the situation can be. Now, if you take a militant group that is made up of 3,000 fighters, which is not so much, in fact. Those who are familiar with terrorist groups would understand having 3,000 fighters is not really large. And each is paid a monthly allowance of rupees 5,000, which is also not much. The need for cash just for paying the terrorists every month comes to rupees 15 million or 300,000, over $320,000 at the current exchange rate. Now the question is, where will this money come from? Now we have seen with militant groups, in fact, very quickly, they had to, in fact, switch to narco trades. Even Tamil Tigers, which had, in fact, a reputation of not being indulging earlier on, in fact, on narco trading, later on had to switch to narco trade. So one can see the non-state, in fact, and the combination of the drug and the arms bazaar goes together. The last one is the post-state, and this refers to the offshore exploration. Well, researchers would point out whenever it comes to the offshore exploration, they would say, and let me quote one young researcher who wrote very recently, the most recent standoff took place, and this is again between Bangladesh and Myanmar, in November 2008, when 4 Korean ships guarded by Myanmar's Navy started exploration for oil and gas reserves. This is reference to the Dawes exploration within 50 nautical miles southwest of St. Martin Island. And again, you'll find another researcher writing, Myanmar has extensive natural gas deposits. Exploration with the help of Chinese and Korean companies are on the way. When it comes to Bangladesh, you will read in the media, and let me cite from one media report says, ConocoPhillips of the United States has signed an agreement with Bangladesh state-owned, and goes on and on. Now here also it is interesting, the focus is on the resources, but not on the post-state elements. Far better would have been, in fact, if both Bangladesh and Myanmar would be in a position to coordinate and collaborate and raise funds and not invite external agencies, in fact, because they would have their own say in whatever is being read from this offshore exploration. Now, let me end by what is to be done, in fact. Well, the time has come to think out of the box, in fact. Now, historically, there have been 2 approaches in foreign policy making in most part of the world, but in Asia. One approach, the South Asian approach, I call it biryani approach. And I'm sure you're familiar with biryani, where everything is put together, the meat, the potato, the fruits. And I always tell my students that one day you will see even mobile phones in the biryani, in fact. We have to wait for that. Now, that is where I think South Asia sometimes gets locked, in fact. And I can talk about Bangladesh and India relations, in fact, because you put everything together. If you do that, in fact, you have to be a fantastic chef, in fact. Not everybody can cook biryani, unless you are a fantastic leader, in fact, and a super leader, in fact, to cook biryani or having a biryani foreign policy making is not easy. And again, we see faltering, in fact. Recently in India-Bangladesh relations, one element in the biryani, momota, spoiled the entire biryani, so you can see how things can be really bad. The other approach, in fact, which I call the Chinese approach, is the yin and yang approach, in fact. You balance the opposites, in fact. And I think the Chinese have succeeded doing that. It's partly also Singaporean's approach also. That is, whichever works, you take that, in fact. China, India have all the bad relations one can talk about, border claims, Dalai Lama, other things. But as we speak, India's largest trading partner is China. They have no problem with that. China doesn't recognize Taiwan, but Taiwanese have one of the largest investment in mainland China. They have no problem with that. So that yin and yang approach is something that one has to work on that. Now, keeping that in light, in fact, let me just flag 4 or 5 things, and then I'll stop. One is that one has to start thinking of establishing industries for people of both sides, Bangladesh, Myanmar, keeping the stateless also. You can't keep people stateless forever. And work permit is the other. Fencing, one has to rethink. But the one I want to end by saying is, I think it's time that we talk about SAARC. I think it's time that full membership be given both to China and Myanmar. Now, it is important to keep in mind that in 18th century, China was the largest economy, and second largest was undivided India. If that is the case, I think what we see 200 years after is the re-rise of China. I'm not sure of divided India re-rising as much as undivided South Asia rising, but I think one has to start thinking on those lines if we are serious about doing something about the stateless, the non-state, and the post-state. Thank you very much.
He is Professor of International Law and Marine Affairs and Director of the Center for Ocean Affairs and the Law of Sea Institute for International Law, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. He is currently visiting fellow at the East Asia Institute of National University of Singapore. He studied at the World Maritime University, Sweden, and is a postdoctoral fellow of the Dalhousie University, Canada, and the visiting research fellow at the Center for International Law, NUS. He was nominated by China as an expert for special arbitration under Article 2, Annex 8 of the United Nations Convention on Law of Sea. And he won the highest research award from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in 2007 and 2008 for his outstanding policy advice to the Chinese central government.
First,